consistent. As a candidate, he broke the mold. As president, he broke the mold. And in post-presidency, Donald Trump is still redefining political norms, this time as the first former president to face criminal indictment. Trump says this is still part of an ongoing politically motivated witch hunt against him. Others contend this is the justice system catching up to Trump on the first of several legal fronts. Here this morning to discuss this and some state politics, the two Steves are back with us again. We have Steve Marchand, Democrat, former mayor of Portsmouth, and Steve Negron, two-time nominee for Congress on the Republican side in the 2nd Congressional District. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here.
Good morning, Adam.
So,
Morning, Steve.
Mr. Negron, let's start with you. There were aspects of Mr. Trump's conduct that you didn't agree with, but you still supported him anyway. What's your perspective on this indictment?
Well, it's really funny, Adam, and when you look about what's happening, and it's not just with this indictment against the former president, is you're looking at, in my opinion, about this tyrannical power that I believe that the folks that are in power right now are using. And it's funny that the power that they have is we granted to them that power by virtue of voting for them. And I think the issue becomes is that where is that slippery slope where, you know, these are some old Soviet tactics, in my opinion, where if there's a political adversary that you don't like, you go after them. You know, this isn't just isolated to President Trump. We saw that just recently this week. I think that there was a reporter, Taibbi, who was testifying on the Hill about some things with what Elon Musk had released from Twitter files. And then that very same day, actually during his testimony, he was visited by an IRS agent to talk about some returns that they wanted to discuss with him. Now, I know many people who have been audited by the IRS. There hasn't been a single person visited by an IRS agent. Usually it's a letter, or usually they try to get some time in an IRS office to do that. So it just seems that it's never a situation that's evenly spread. It seems that there are some people that they don't want to have a voice. They go after them, and it's not just isolated. We saw during school board meetings that the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the best law enforcement agency in the world, was asked to go look at some of these parents who were there to defend and find out about what their children were being taught and label them as domestic terrorists. So I think it's a shame on what's happening right now when we're actually on a slippery slope by allowing people using their power that they have in a way to quiet people, when in fact we should all should be regarded as having a right under the Bill of Rights, and I think that's slowly eroding right now.
Steve Marchand, politics at play here or the justice system at work?
Well, clearly, the president can never be above the law, and the president is just like the rest of us in terms of the relationship to the law. Indeed, with this indictment that's been handed down, it was a jury of his peers that had to determine there was at least probable cause, which is not the same standard as the trial would be itself, but it means more likely than not probable, and it is his peers. We have to remember, just because the title is ex-president of the United States does not change the rules of the road. We should also remember this is the first of what potentially could be multiple legal situations that the former president may deal with. There's a special counsel out of Washington, D.C. There's the question in Georgia, and some pretty compelling evidence, at least to the layman, of some problems with the Georgia election and how President Trump handled that. And then there's January 6th related events as well. I'm not a lawyer, and everybody deserves the right to be innocent until proven guilty. However, there is a process, and a jury of his peers came back and said there's probable cause to go forward. So let's let the system play out as we would with anybody. But clearly, and this is the political hat being put on for a second, it is never, generally speaking, it is never good to be arrested.
Okay.
We've talked about, or Steve, you mentioned the implications you see for the country. What about the potential implications in this Republican race for president? Not only is this unprecedented on just that side of things, but now you have a primary campaign that's going to have this drop right into the middle of it. What happens to Republicans?
That's a great question. And I think, and we all know here on the stage, right, that those people that support President Trump, this is not going to faze them in one iota. As a matter of fact, they may even look at this as a moment to galvanize behind him. There may be people who would have been willing to move away from President Trump, but now they see that this overreach of government power is something that they don't even want to, regardless of who it's against, and that may be a rallying cry for some of the folks in the President Trump's camp. And I think that's something that is calculated. I don't think that this Manhattan DA kind of thought about those things. One thing too that I wanted to mention is that, you know, a former federal prosecutor and the Federal Election Commission looked at the same evidence and chose not to file against President Trump for the exact same thing that we're talking about. So I think, quite frankly, if they thought that this would minimize his effect, I think, quite frankly, it's going to have the opposite effect, and it's going to galvanize the people for Trump.
From the Democratic side, Steve, on the political implications of this, obviously Democrats are galvanized in the opposite direction. But what about those middle-of-the-road voters? Do you think, how do they see this?
Well, first, it's not clear how many middle-of-the-road voters there really are anymore these days. So it may be a relatively small number. I do think that there is at least a plurality of New Hampshireites and Americans who, regardless of whether they voted for President Trump or not in 2016 and 2020, in their heart would kind of like to do something fresh, even if ideologically it might be similar. There's a fatigue about all of this that I do think that for that subset of Americans, it's very exhausting. And let's face it, this isn't going away next week. Next Tuesday at 2:15 is when the arraignment is supposed to occur. And just as all of 2015 and 2016, when all of us in the media, those of us on both sides of the aisle, couldn't help but look at an empty dais on a stage, waiting an hour at a time for candidate Trump to show up. Once again, here we are. For hours before he shows up at that 2:15 time, we'll have cameras across the world that will be aimed at an empty sidewalk that he probably won't even ever walk on. He'll go underneath to get in, and we're all going to be doing the same thing. So the reality is, for Republicans certainly, I think Steve identified it, there is I don't know if it's a majority or a sizable plurality, but right now, Donald Trump is more likely to be the nominee for Republicans at this moment than he was a year ago. He's moving further ahead of Ron DeSantis and other Republicans in the polls today than he was 6 months ago. This is a major problem, not just for the Republican Party, it is for the country, because it keeps us in this morass that is exhausting, it is frustrating, but for Democrats, for better or worse, it is galvanizing, because we look at the existential threat that we see a re-elected Donald Trump, what the message would be to him if he were to win re-election, right, in the midst of all of these things going on. What would it tell him?
You mentioned other candidates. Steve Negron, do you think Governor Chris Sununu is actually going to jump into this race and run for president?
Well, I think it's going to be an interesting time for this. I think that what we need to do is look at what happened in 2016, where we had, I think it was 17 candidates on the Republican side to go through. What I do know is that for anybody that's going to run for president in this state, right, the voters on both sides, Democrat or Republican, they're informed voters in this state, right? You have to meet and greet people 2, 3, 4 times before you can actually get their vote. So I think what's going to happen is that, you know, anybody should be able to run. And I think that there are some phenomenal candidates that are out there. If Governor Sununu decided to run, I think that's exactly what he's done. He's done some great things here in the state. It'll be interesting to see who are the other ones that are going to come out and run. I think one of the things that we need to come together, both parties, is fight for this first in the nation that I think, unfortunately, at the national level, the Democratic Party has abandoned New Hampshire. And I think we need to come back together and realize how important New Hampshire is. And I think if Governor Sununu decided to run, I think he's going to be in the mix with everybody else, and it'll be exciting to see.
Pro-choice Republican works here. Does it work anywhere else in the country?
Well, you know, I think I would expand it to not even just pro-choice, you know, is that can a moderate Republican be able to have that across the state? People will look at what has happened here in our state over the past 3-4 years. You know, we went through, like every other state, during the COVID. I think Governor Sununu did some outstanding things. There's some knocks on him, right, because of some people thinking that he took favorites or sides. But I think a moderate Republican in a presidential race, people would have to get to know Governor Sununu. We know him, but there are people out in Idaho or Utah that wouldn't know him from Adam, not the Adam, but the other Adam.
Right.
And so he would have some work to do. But I think, you know, he would have a message, and he'd have to try to appeal to those people who don't know him and let him have a shot, just like everybody else.
Steve Marchand, this could be an open governor's race. Sununu might end up running for re-election. We don't know. But which Democrats do you think are going to step forward to run for that corner office?
Well, certainly we don't know at all yet what Governor Sununu will end up doing in 2024. And that would have an impact, I think, on which Democrats and the timing would be in 2024. My personal opinion, that of many others, is that if current Congressman Pappas were to decide to come stateside, you know, in terms of running for governor, that would probably clear the field, frankly. If he decided not to, for any number of reasons, and it'll be a competitive congressional race either way, whether he runs again or not there are a number of other folks who've been waiting to run, whether it's Executive Councilor Cindy Warmington, exiting Manchester Mayor Joyce Craig, 2022 gubernatorial nominee Tom Sherman. There are a number of current state senators. There's been a bit of a backlog, as somebody who tried to take on Governor Sununu, I know this. There are a lot of folks who have been waiting, And 2024 may be the explosion of that, particularly if Congressman Pappas were to not run for it.
All right, the two Steves. It wasn't Steve versus Steve, it's a Steve and Steve. You guys get along really well. So we always appreciate the time,
Absolutely.
gentlemen. Thanks so much
You bet.
for being here.